Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the channel if you're new. Welcome back if you aren't. I'm EDJ, and we have been through quite a ride in this series. We've seen Napoleon rise, we've seen him at its peak, and now we're in the downfall. From the Spanish, invasion onward, Napoleon has been on a steady decline, but the Russian invasion is where it just... that's it. The Grand Army is no longer grand after Russia. And yeah, so the Russian campaign, I mentioned many videos that the three big mistakes Napoleon makes in his life that most people will tell you about are: 1, the continental system, which hurt France and her allies. The second is the invasion of Spain, and this is the third one, the infamous invasion of Russia. And the reason for this is because, well, Napoleon did things that just upset Tsar Alexander. The Duchy of Warsaw, which was right next to, Russia, did not help them. The continental system was ruinous for the Russian economy, and yeah, Napoleon just alienated his ally. Like, I'm trying to think, like, yeah, the reason Tsar Alexander and Napoleon fell off is because of Napoleon and what he did. And yeah, like, Napoleon, at this point, at least in terms of numbers, numerically, Napoleon is at his peak, because he was able to assemble an army of 600,000 men, nearly 1 million. And yeah, numerically, yes, but I feel like Napoleon faltered because he wasn't used to commanding. Like, there are many factors that made this campaign ruinous. First, Napoleon lost his speed advantage. Because of the Russian scorched earth policy, Napoleon had to rely a lot on supply trains, which heavily slowed down his army. So he didn't have the usual speed, and also, I believe the thing is, this army he assembled was from all over the place. The Polish, I think even Austria, joined. It was multi-ethnical, and, the chain of command wasn't the best, and... yeah, overall, I don't think Napoleon was used to commanding an army of this size. So far, Napoleon's always kind of been the underdog. This might be the one time where Napoleon is not the underdog in this situation. He is the overdog. I don't think that's the correct opposite, but this is Napoleon where all the things are at his side on paper, but he falters because, I just think mainly because... yeah, he wasn't used to commanding an army of this size and this many different, nations and ethnic groups in, so he probably had a hard time with that. Losing his speed and maneuverability to catch the Russians who were retreating. And yeah, just Napoleon made a lot of mistakes, and there was a lot... This is I'm not even gonna say arguably, this is Napoleon's biggest disaster in terms of his military career. This is where everything is just goes down, And at the end, even before he gets to Moscow, he loses so much of his army. We usually think of him leaving Russia during the winter, but I'm pretty sure he lost more men just getting to Moscow. That summer march that caused so many of his own people to desert or, die of exhaustion. Just, this was Napoleon... this is Napoleon's army, just the entire situation, the biggest disaster and his lowest point, I would argue. This is an unmitigated disaster. And I feel safe in saying that, and it pains me to say that. Even if I'm trying to be objective, there's no other way to look at it. This is a blunder of epic proportions. And, you know, it's sad to be at this point in the series because, you know, we're so used to Napoleon. Like I said, we witnessed his rise and his peak, and now, from here on out, we're watching him plummet. You know, like Icarus flying to the sun and then falling. Like, that's where... This is where Napoleon falls. And, you know, Napoleon, I will say, he wasn't out for the count after the Russian invasion. You know, he went on to win a lot of impressive battles against Prussia and Russia. And, you know, my favorite, the 6 Days Campaign, where Napoleon performs beautifully. But, you know, this is the moment he loses his might. I think Napoleon's entire claim to power isn't through blood or a bloodline or an established system like the rest of Europe who are monarchs from families and all that. Napoleon's entire claim is through conquest. Right makes right, you know? And this is where he loses his might. And like I said, he goes on to win many more impressive battles, you know, but like, this is where the rest of Europe sees like sharks in the water. This is where Napoleon bleeds and everyone just smells it, and this is what leads to his ultimate defeat. You know? Granted, he had a chance at like Leipzig and probably the Frankfurt proposals if he had accepted them, but then again, we'll get there when we get there. I know not everyone in the coalition was on board with that, but point is, as things stand with the benefit of hindsight, if he hadn't done this, the rest of Europe probably wouldn't have been as bold to fight him, and leading to his inevitable abdication and loss of power. So yeah, it's almost funny. Napoleon at the peak of his power is where he blunders the hardest, right? And I say peak numerically. Like, I think in terms of like skill and veterans and performance, definitely the War of the Third Coalition was, in my opinion, him at his best. But here, he's at his best in terms of numbers, I think. And, yeah. This is gonna be really hard to watch, guys. I'm not gonna lie with you. But we gotta do it. So, yeah, guys, so let's get to it. I'll be adding my commentary. But if you don't want to hear me constantly talk and pause the video, the link to this video will be down in the description down below. And let's get to it. Let's watch Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. One must never ask more from fortune than she can grant.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history. In 1807, following his defeat of the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon had traveled to Tilsit to meet the Russian Emperor Alexander.
And they kissed.
During their celebrated encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and made an alliance.
The infamous kiss, man. The bromance was real at one point. Man, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander, one of the most gut-wrenching breakups in all of history, man.
But it was not to last. Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia cooled dramatically. The Russians were irritated by Napoleon's creation of a Duchy of Warsaw in Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard. They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state, a traditional thorn in Russia's side. Then there was Napoleon's offer to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement their alliance. But the Romanovs hated the idea, and after a year of Russian prevarication, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, instead. Later that year, Napoleon broke a guarantee made at Tilsit and annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law. Worst of all was the fallout over the continental system, Napoleon's not very effective economic blockade against Britain, designed to cripple his most steadfast enemy. Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit, but it was hugely unpopular in Russia and ruinous to her finances during a period of economic crisis. When Napoleon found out that Russia was flouting the rules of the system and had resumed an illicit trade with Britain, he was furious. With both emperors accusing the other of bad faith, their two countries began preparing for war.
You know, like I said, I try to be objective about the situation. But I'm gonna say it, I think Napoleon's definitely more in the wrong than Alexander. I'm not gonna say Alexander is completely innocent, but yeah, Napoleon gave a lot of reasons there for Tsar Alexander to not want to be his ally anymore. I would say Napoleon is in the wrong, at least more in the wrong, and that this falling out between them is certainly his fault, in my opinion. And yeah, Napoleon didn't have many allies to begin with, so, and the ones he did, he managed to make them enemies due to his reforms, ideas, and his actions, which ultimately did not work in his favor in the long run.
This video is brought to you by our sponsor.
Sorry, I had technical issues there. At Tilsit, Russia swore an eternal alliance with France. Now she breaks her oaths. Does she believe us degenerate? Are we no longer the soldiers of Austerlitz?
Napoleon knew an invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking, especially as he still had an unfinished war in Spain that was tying down more than 200,000 troops. Nevertheless, in 1811, he began to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, around 600,000 men, though less than half of them were French. The rest came from allied states across Europe. There was a Polish corps from the Duchy of Warsaw, led by Prince Poniatowski, a corps from each of the German kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria, from the Kingdom of Italy, as well as Swiss, Dutch, Croat, Spanish, and Portuguese units scattered throughout the army. There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria, France's recent enemies, now uneasy allies. Some of these allied troops, such as the Poles and Germans, were as reliable as their French counterparts. Others were very inexperienced, or, like the Prussians and Austrians, reluctant to be there at all.
You know, I'm pretty sure the practical reason Napoleon assembled an army of this magnitude was obviously the practical reason being, you know, he figured invading Russia would be no easy feat. He probably anticipated trouble. And yeah, you know, wanted as much manpower in case something happened. But I also think, I have no basis for this, mind you. I'm just spitting whatever comes to my head. I think Napoleon really wanted to flex. I think he wanted to show off his power. Like, you know, the continental system was being defied by Russia, and I suppose maybe to dissuade anyone else from thinking they could do the same, he wanted to show off his power. Him as the master of Europe at this point, he wanted to show off just how big his muscles were, I guess you can say, and he assembled this army, you know, to kind of show everyone, see look at what, if you defy me, look at what I can assemble, you know? I have the largest army of all time. Don't mess with me. And I don't know. I guess a bit of ego, a bit of pride on Napoleon's part. Like I said, I don't know. Probably not. I'm probably wrong. I don't know the man personally. But that's a guess. And probably my headcanon.
Gigantic formation was deployed in 3 armies. The main force under Napoleon himself, another led by his stepson, Eugène, and a third led by his younger brother, Jérôme, king of...
You know, I know about Jérôme. I believe it's Jérôme who doesn't perform well in this campaign. I believe he eventually just leaves or gets kicked out or resigns. So yeah, Jérôme. Good old nepotism, right? But I think another problem is that Napoleon probably put in charge certain people in this campaign that probably shouldn't have been in charge. Like I said, I'm not that well versed in these guys, but I'm pretty sure Napoleon probably ought to have chosen different people to be more in charge. Then again, I guess Jerome's a king at this point, so maybe he would have seen it as beneath him to take orders from a marshal like such as Davout or something, but I don't know. I feel like leadership and command also is an issue during the invasion of Russia, you know?
Westphalia. Neither of these two were experienced commanders. Though one would distinguish himself on campaign, the other would not. On their left flank, Marshal MacDonald led 10th Corps with a large Prussian contingent, while the right flank was guarded by General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 troops were in reserve, including Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. Initially, the Russians only had 220,000 men to face this juggernaut, organized into Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army, Prince Bagration's 2nd Army, and General Tomasov's 3rd Army. They would be outnumbered 2-1. But in the run-up to war, Russia scored 2 crucial diplomatic triumphs. Sweden had been at war with Russia just 3 years earlier, a conflict which cost her Finland. By a curious turn of events, Sweden was ruled by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte. But after Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania without warning, a furious Bernadotte promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire...
About that. You know, guys, I feel like I've been doing a decent job at not just, you know, trying to be objective, trying to understand where everyone's coming from, and not just mindlessly, I guess, dumping, to put it nicely, on people. And, I will admit to you all now that Bernadotte's kind of my least favorite marshal. I get, like I said, I would say the worst, but that's just a personal opinion. Obviously, if you look at feats and what they did through that, he's probably not the worst, obviously, but, like, the reason I feel like that is because I kind of came into this series knowing Bernadotte eventually turns on Napoleon, and like, oh, Bernadotte, you traitor, because we've been very pro-Napoleon in this series, but, I'm gonna be objective, and I'm gonna say Bernadotte, I understand exactly where he's coming from. Napoleon invaded Swedish territory, and Bernadotte's no longer the marshal. Bernadotte, he is the king Bernadotte, he has a duty to his people that goes above any loyalty to Napoleon. Like, I think of Alexander, like, yeah, they were buddies for a bit there, but at the end, Russia started suffering under the continental system, and opening trade with Britain is just, yeah, that's the best move you can do for your people, for your nation. And, Bernadotte made the right call, even when he joins the Allies, the coalition. I'm sorry. When he joins the coalition, I get it, like, you know? Like, Napoleon had lost, Napoleon had done something not right by that invasion of Swedish Pomerania, and I understand Bernadotte completely, you know? And, you know, I mentioned several videos ago, the thing is, Napoleon, all of Europe was beefing with Napoleon. Napoleon did not have many allies, to put it nicely, in Europe. And the thing is, the few allies he did have... Wait, but first, yeah, everyone was beefing, and the thing is, Napoleon was going... His enemies were other great nations, like Austria or Prussia. He couldn't just get rid of them, you know? And he never found a way to subdue them in terms of military force or any other way, so they could always just kind of get back to fighting him at a later point. Napoleon never found a way to neutralize those threats for a lasting time. So not only does Napoleon have an issue with most of Europe, who will constantly fight him, but there are times here where he could have had great allies, you know? Spain had been his most steadfast ally, and he turned them against him by invading them and getting rid of their monarchy. You know, Bernadotte, Sweden, that could have been a potential ally that could have lasted a while, but here he goes, he makes this issue with Swedish Pomerania and kind of upsets another nation. Russia, him and Tsar Alexander kissed, but, you know, they seemed really on good terms for a bit there, and if Napoleon probably had been better at diplomacy or not doing things to upset them, especially with the continental system, he could have kept those three potential powerful allies and probably secured his throne for the remainder of his life. But, you know, he had issues with, like, he just found a way to alienate, ostracize, and eventually anger his allies, the very few he had, turning them against him. But by the end, he had no allies or friends. Like, you know, like, I hate to criticize Napoleon like this, but Napoleon messed up big time. He just completely, you know, messed up, and he probably had to up his diplomatic game or something. But yeah, Napoleon really pushed away any friends he could have had. And, you know, like, maybe they would have turned on him eventually, but in our main timeline, it's all Napoleon's fault. Like, okay, obviously, no one's completely innocent, but, like, yeah, a lot of this is just Napoleon's actions, you know? To where you could look and be like, I understand exactly why Russia turned on him, or Sweden, or Spain. Like, it's hard to, like, argue for Napoleon in these instances, because he really is the biggest offender. And, yeah, Napoleon just eventually alienated any allies he did have until he was completely alone. And yeah, that's a big issue. That's another flaw with him.
Ended Russia's 6-year war against its southern rival. These two agreements secured Russia's flanks from any strategic threat and freed up troops to face Napoleon's invasion.
I'm about to embark on the greatest and most difficult enterprise I've ever attempted. But what has been begun must be carried through. And you know, that's something else I want to talk about. Wait, is that a Napoleon quote? I feel like this is something else with Napoleon. Napoleon strikes me as a kind of guy that when he makes a mistake, he's not willing to call it off. Or, obviously he can admit a mistake long after the fact, like we did with Spain, but I feel like at the heat of the moment, when Napoleon is making these big mistakes like the continental system, the invasion of Spain, or, you know, Russia, I feel like I feel like normally I'd probably be like, well, you know what, I'm making a mistake, I'm gonna stop right here, maybe reevaluate. he seems like kind of guy, you know, the kind of guy who would put his feet and head in the sand and just keep going with it even though it's not going well. I feel like Napoleon is like that with the continental system, and you know, if he hadn't been so stubborn and trying to keep that, this invasion probably wouldn't be happening, because that seems like that was seemed to be the nail, the final wait. Yeah, that seems to be like the straw that broke the camel's back. The Alexander defying the continental system. But it's like, yeah, it's a bad idea. It's a bad system. But Napoleon, even though it's hurting France and his allies, he's just like, no, we're gonna keep it. I'm gonna enforce it, and we're gonna go. Like, you know, when arguably he should have probably disbanded it or just not tried. Arguably, the sooner he disbanded it would have been better for everyone, and his allies probably would have been happier about that. But instead, he tried to enforce it. And again, I think it's pride. I don't know the man personally. This is just now me talking off the top of my head, but I think Napoleon's pride wouldn't allow him to admit that this wasn't a good idea, the continental system, and it led him to his downfall. I guess a bit of hubris, if you would. And yeah, Napoleon's life reads kind of like a Greek tragedy, you know? Someone who rose to great heights, but a bit of pride or hubris always being an undoing. Again, I think that, personally. Man, Napoleon was talking about the great undertaking he had to do to invade Russia. I'm taking a great undertaking just recording this video. Yeah, as I was recording, my grandpa called me, and I had to go drop off one of his workers to, like, the nearest bus station. And then my mom came home, and then, like, my grandma came home, and then they said, let's go out to eat, and so we went and bought food, and then I got my ears cleaned, because I have a lot of earwax, and now I'm here, like 3 hours after the last pause. Oh man. This video is gonna take a while.
On the 24th of June 1812, French troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army was so large, the crossing took 5 days. Napoleon's plan was to attack north of the impassable Pripet marshes and defeat Barclay's army, while Jérôme pinned Bagration in place. French forces would then swing south to trap Bagration. Napoleon expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks. But the sheer size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was his only option. Prince Bagration, a much more aggressive commander by instinct, and often Barclay's fierce critic, was forced to agree. As they withdrew, they burned villages and crops, part of a scorched earth strategy to deny supplies to the enemy. In 4 days, Napoleon had reached Vilnius, but Barclay was gone. To the south, Jérôme failed to pin down Bagration. So when Davout's First Corps swung southeast to trap him, he'd already withdrawn to safety. Napoleon's younger brother was out of his depth. Stung by the Emperor's criticism, humiliated when his troops were put under Marshal Davout's command, he resigned his post and returned to Westphalia.
Yeah, arguably Davout should have just been in charge the whole time. But yeah, see, I think this is where we're starting to see the speed restriction. Napoleon, maybe his idea would have worked if he had his usual corps system, but like I said, the sheer size of his army made these guys, Russian generals, pull back, and Napoleon couldn't catch them because, like I said, the sheer size of his army and just how slow it is. Like, I think Napoleon's plan would have worked if he didn't have an army this big. Like, yeah.
The campaign was already beginning to expose serious flaws in Napoleon's plan. Knowing his troops would struggle to live off the land in this impoverished region, he'd organized huge supply depots and transport units to feed the army. But wagons rolled slowly along Russia's bad roads, which were turned to rivers of mud by summer thunderstorms. The army had to make frequent stops to allow its supplies to catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but a much-needed relief for the many thousands of young conscripts in his army, not used to hard marches day after day. Many were soon dropping out with exhaustion. Others deserted. There were also huge problems of command and control over a vast multinational army that was 3 times bigger than any Napoleon had commanded before. La Grande Armée, once famed for its speed of maneuver, had become a lumbering beast.
Yes, that's actually like legitimately what I said. Like, you know, I don't think Napoleon is used to commanding an army this big, and yeah, with the supply trains already slowing down an already slow, huge army, you know, the scorched earth slowed them down even more, and it's like, yeah, Napoleon, famed for his speed, has essentially handicapped himself in a way. He's been handicapped to one of his most essential strengths. And, you know, it's like, yeah, just insane. Napoleon, in a weird way, is handicapped now.
After a pause to rest and regroup at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, where he hoped Bagration's Second Army would be able to join him. But Davout blocked Bagration's path at Sultanovka, forcing him to make for Smolensk instead. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but once more the Russians escaped, after setting fire to all the stores they couldn't take with them. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, on Napoleon's southern flank, Russian Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon 7th Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps to their aid. By the end of July, Napoleon had advanced 250 miles into Russia, much further than he'd planned. And the long marches in extreme summer heat continued to take a heavy toll on his men. Without fighting a major battle, the army had already suffered 20% casualties, from exhaustion and illness, particularly typhus and dysentery. The army had entered Russia with 250,000 horses, but they were now dying at a rate of 1,000 every day, from exhaustion and lack of fodder. It wasn't just cavalry horses that were dying, but the very horses that were supposed to haul the army's transport wagons, making a bad situation worse.
Yeah, there's no nice way of putting it. Just a complete disaster. And yeah, not well managed at all. The situation is just, you know, Napoleon lost so many men just get in the summer march to Moscow. Like, you know, it's just a disaster of epic proportions. And, you know, yeah.
This crisis in horsepower came just as the French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, met their match in Russia's Cossacks.
こんにちは、司令官先輩。一人ぼっちで寂しいの？ならアニメファンや最強軍用機で。
If Napoleon had Cossacks in his army, he would have been emperor of China long ago.
Cossacks, self-reliant, proud, ruthless, and superb horsemen, didn't play by the same rules as other European cavalry. Every day they shadowed Napoleon's army, swooping in whenever they saw an easy target, but melting away into the forests if they were attacked by a stronger force. Cossacks, as well as Russian partisans, made hit-and-run attacks on French supply lines and depots, forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to their defense. Alongside Russian regular light cavalry, they also prevented French patrols from carrying out reconnaissance, which meant that Napoleon often lacked good information about roads or the enemy's whereabouts. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting his troops and considering his options. Among his many mounting concerns was the security of his long, exposed flanks. But at Vitebsk, he received news that Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Gorodezhna. A week later at Polotsk, a French Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. Napoleon's flanks were secure, for now. Although his main force had been reduced to less than half its original strength, Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk and try to...
See what I mean? Like, so much, so quick. That's insane. He lost so many men. And this is even before the winter. Like, this is... Eesh, you know, very, not a good situation. Though, you know, I'm of the opinion that Napoleon works best when he has a smaller army. Like, you know, like... Yeah, I don't know if Napoleon just wasn't ready for an army of this magnitude or what. But yeah, it didn't work out well. And there are many factors, such as the supply lines, how deep into enemy territory they ended up, like, you know, but... Yeah, like, I don't know. I just think Napoleon, in my opinion, works at his best when he has like a smaller army and he can utilize his speed. Like, I think that's Napoleon at his best, you know?
To force the Russians into a decisive battle for the city. Barclay was indeed under pressure to give battle from fellow commander Prince Bagration and Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. The army's morale and Russia's honor required it, they told him. With the First and Second Russian armies finally linking up near Smolensk, Barclay decided to attack Napoleon's army, which he believed was concentrated around Rudnya. The offensive was led by General Platov's Cossacks, who surprised a French cavalry division at Inkovo. But alarmed by false reports that Eugene's Fourth Corps was outflanking him to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Napoleon, reassured that Barclay's offensive posed no real threat, began a grand outflanking move to the south to take Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was Napoleon at his best, using Murat's cavalry to screen his movements and keep Barclay in the dark. The Emperor reached the Dnieper on the evening of the 13th of August. His engineers quickly threw up 4 pontoon bridges, and by dawn the next day, his army was across. Marshal Davout led a second column across the river at Orsha. But a single Russian division, the 27th, fought a heroic fighting retreat from Krasny, delaying the French advance and buying time for Bagration to reinforce the Smolensk garrison. The chance for a surprise assault on the city was lost. And as the Russian army began to pull back, Napoleon displayed an uncharacteristic lack of urgency, even halting the army for a parade to mark his 43rd birthday.
Yeah, there is a... yeah, Napoleon... You know... I remember, like, when I was researching this, that there's a lot of debate that, yeah, Napoleon decided to celebrate his birthday here, but there is talk that if Napoleon had decided not to do that, he perhaps could have caught them and won, like, right then and there, you know? And yeah, I think even Oversimplified mentioned that in the Napoleonic Wars episode. Napoleon probably could have caught them, but he decided to. Maybe they would have gotten away anyways, but yeah, it's this lack of urgency which is a little concerning, because I feel like not even Napoleon fully realizes the direness of the situation until the winter comes. Like, I'm not saying he's not taking this any bit seriously, don't misinterpret me, please. I don't think he realizes how fast he really needs to get this over with. Like, you think losing so much of his army just getting to this point would have probably been a wake-up call, but no, I feel like, like I said, even when Napoleon does take Moscow, he thinks, oh, I've won, like, and he just chills out until the winter starts. I think that's when he's like, oh no, like, that's where everything fully, like, sets in, but yeah, who knows? Like I said, who knows if Napoleon had not done this, if he could have caught them and won already, but assuming that that is the case, then yeah, this lack of urgency is a little bit concerning on Napoleon's part. And yeah, just probably not the best move he could have made, to put it nicely.
When the main attack on Smolensk began 2 days later, Napoleon opted for a frontal assault. 150 French guns battered the city as 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted bravely, but Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. With Smolensk in flames, the Russians began to pull out. Just as the French fought their way into the city, to scenes of utter devastation. Bagration's Second Army withdrew first. As Barclay's army followed, its rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valutino. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian Eighth Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat. But having crossed the river, he did nothing, and the opportunity was lost.
Yeah, and this isn't completely all Napoleon's fault. I don't mean to sound like this entire video that, oh, everything is 100% Napoleon's fault. Like, again, management and I guess some hesitation and mistakes from his own men also resulted in, you know, a more favorable outcome for the Russians. And yeah, I will say though, what was interesting is when Napoleon opted for a frontal assault, which is, you know, well, yeah, it makes sense, you're taking the city, but I remember from the oversimplified Napoleonic Wars video, he said especially during this time of Russia, during this Russian campaign, that Napoleon's tactics became a little less refined and a little more, how did he put it? A little less refined, a little more charge at the enemy and try not to die. Again, that's oversimplified. Don't shoot me. Don't attack me. That's not what I'm saying at all. Though I will say, I do think, yeah, Napoleon, there's a lot going on with the French camp during this campaign that, you know, a lot of mistakes and issues, you know, not just from Napoleon, but the people who he put in charge, like Jerome and whatnot. And yeah, you could say that this is Napoleon not at his best, I think is the nicest way to put it. This is France and Napoleon not at their best. Not to say he sucks, mind you, it's just, yeah, it's almost like, you know, there's a certain point in Napoleon's career where, like, you have early Napoleon and then you have, like, peak Napoleon, and you know, like somewhere around the Spain issue and this invasion of Russia, that like it almost seems like the Napoleon of old was gone, and something was up with him, to put it lightly. Like, is he losing it? Obviously no, because like I think, you know, especially in later with like the 6 Days campaign, like how beautifully he defended or tried to defend Paris. Like Napoleon still had it. I think even at his not at his best, I don't want to say this is his worst. I don't want to say that. I don't think Napoleon ever had a worst. It's just here not at his best. No, maybe that's not the right way to put it. Not at his best. Either way, even when Napoleon wasn't, you know, I don't know how else to put it. I'm trying to put it right. I lack a certain eloquence when speaking about this, and I hope I don't say something that misinterprets, but yeah, I'll just say it. Napoleon, even not at his best, is still better than, like, everyone around him. You know, I don't know.
Furious Napoleon swore that Junot would never now win his marshal's baton. The Battle of Smolensk cost both sides around 10,000 casualties and destroyed one of Russia's most historic and holy cities, but settled nothing.
Before a month is out, we shall be in Moscow. In 6 weeks, we shall have peace. Oh boy.
After the missed chance to defeat the Russians at Smolensk, Napoleon paused once more to consider his options. His men were weary and far from home, and it was already late.
Yeah, like I said, that's not all. I don't want to make it all sound like it's all Napoleon. Like, even the people working around him couldn't fully, like Junot right there. It was Junot, right? Like, even he failed to fully implement Napoleon's plan, which probably would have worked even with that delay of his birthday. Maybe if Junot had done what Napoleon had said, like, they would have won. So like, yeah, like, you know, there's a bit of, like I said, it's weird. It's like, I don't mean to say no one's trying their best or anything. It's just, there seems to be a lot of, like, you know, mess-ups during this time, I guess you can say, mistakes. You know, and it's, like, costing Napoleon, you know.
Late in the campaigning season, he considered sitting out the Russian winter at Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813. But now he was just 230 miles from Moscow. A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg, but Moscow remained its historic and spiritual heart, a prize for which the Russians had to fight. Napoleon, always a gambler, decided to push on. The Russians faced their own dilemma. Emperor Alexander had experienced a kind of religious epiphany that summer and rallied the Russian people to the country's defense, describing the war with Napoleon as a war to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist. For months, the emperor had received conflicting advice to stand and fight or retreat. Now he decided change was needed. The cautious General Barclay kept his job, but the emperor summoned General Mikhail Kutuzov to take overall command of Russia's armies. Kutuzov had been beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz 7 years before, but he'd since won several victories against the Ottoman Empire and was a true Russian, loved by the troops. Although Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, he saw that constant retreats were destroying the soldiers' and the nation's morale. If Moscow was given up without a battle, the fallout could be disastrous. And so, 70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make a stand. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest day's fighting of the Napoleonic Wars.
I think it's interesting that he mentioned that Napoleon was considering waiting out the winter at Smolensk. I wonder if that would have been better for him. Well, the thing is, when he was in Moscow, the reason he couldn't just stay there was mainly because it was so burnt down and destroyed that, you know... But Smolensk was also kind of ruined. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if Napoleon should have done that or not. I understand the risk, the gamble, like, it makes sense to me. Like, wait a minute, I need to take... He knew that they wouldn't give up Moscow, so he's like, this will force them into a battle, and I could have a great decisive victory, so... Yeah. Yeah, I get that, for sure. But, yeah, it also resulted in a lot of bloodiness, now did it? Yeah. So yeah, we'll be looking at Borodino next, and yeah, they definitely did try. As I feel like Napoleon probably wasn't. I'm guessing probably the large army did not benefit Napoleon in the way he thought. Like I said, I think he even mentioned that Napoleon wasn't used to commanding such a large army. So, you know, in the strength and numbers theory, he sacrificed his speed, had to rely a lot on, you know, and it also, you know, the scorched earth also took away more of his speed. And yeah, I feel like Napoleon definitely, even though Napoleon made some mistakes, I feel like he had pretty solid plans that would have worked, but I feel like a lot of the people under him were making mistakes. From, you know, the first was, you know, like the troops under him in particular here seemed to fail to completely carry out Napoleon's orders. You know, like with Jerome and his brother from earlier, and arguably Napoleon could have won like at least 3 times, but mistakes were made, and you know, there were mistakes, and you know, I feel like they're trying, but there's just something off, you know, like they're trying their best, especially Napoleon, but just something's off about this like invasion, you know? It's like I can't put my finger on it, but there's like something weird about this, right? Am I the only one getting that vibe? Like, you know, the mess ups from his men, the elements of the winter. It's almost like even Napoleon's weird lack of urgency there for a second, like it's almost like God himself is like like doing something to mess with the French. I don't know. I don't know how to put it. I don't want to say Napoleon sucks, because he does not suck. I don't even want to say he's not at his best. Like, there's just something off about the whole situation. Let me just put it like that. There's something off with everyone who isn't on Russia's, you know? So, yeah, I'll leave it at that before I just end up saying something I don't really mean. But, yeah, we'll see Borodino next. So, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, everyone.